And Labour has made it clear that they intend to use this legislation to ensure that all of those passenger franchised operations which are currently in the private sector have reverted to the public sector by the end of this parliamentary term.
Welcome to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast. I'm Christian Walmart, an author and journalist who has covered transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we try to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories, policy developments, and interviews in the transport world. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker, who has spent decades looking at transport policies and legislation. So, Mark, what are we covering today?
Hello, Christian, and hello to our listeners. As our second item for this edition of the podcast, we'll be looking at the pressures the UK government is under to save money due to the alleged black hole it's inherited from the Conservatives, and how that might impact on future road building plans in England. But before that, we're going to talk about the rail renationalisation legislation, the Passenger Railway Services Public Ownership Bill. And in fact, we've deliberately postponed or delayed this last episode of Calling All Stations Season 2 to give our listeners a bang-up-to-date report on the progress that's been made with the legislation this very day.
Bit of a mouthful, the title of that, isn't it, Mark?
It is, and it's a bit of a contrivance that reflects the fact that the government decided to bring forward two major pieces of rail legislation. So whereas they might have just brought forward a railways bill, because there's going to be a kind of Labour version of a rail reform bill later on, they needed to have a distinct name for this item and give it a very narrow set of parameters as well to deal very specifically with the issue of the franchises returning to the public sector upon their expiry. So that's why it has this rather curious, as you say, multi-syllable name.
Before we get into the specifics, it is quite curious that they've invested so much in railway legislation. I mean, this is, the first day back in Parliament. It's kind of coming up, and they've got two bills, and it's quite high priority for something that my view is that it's quite high risk that it's going to deliver anything very kind of substantial that they can then show to the public.
I think the political rationale for this was that they did want to deliver something or implement something that they felt could lead to a rapid change, at least a perception of rail, even if not immediately changes to the experience or the service quality or the levels of investment. But also there is in this legislation a bit of old-time religion as well, because the Labour Party at one time had a constitutional pledge to extend public ownership, Clause 4, across the economy. And those flames still burn within the Labour Party and the Labour movement. And I think they also wanted to signal to those deeply held values and opinions and long-term supporters that there was something very distinctly Labour about this administration.
Okay, so yes, I mean, I think there's a wider political intent, and my view has been that this is really to reverse a Tory privatisation and to show, look, we can do this, and we can show that the state runs things better in line with kind of the other state dominated policies, like, for example, creating this energy agency and so on. So that they want to show their radical intent with this, don't they?
Yes, they believe in what they sometimes refer to as the active state. They believe that the state can play a leading role in the development of, for example, industrial strategy, energy policy, as you've just mentioned, and very much transport policy. And today, what's happened is we saw a little bit of an ideological clash in the House of Commons, because today, the 3rd of September, the bill, this rather long named bill, completed all of its common stages towards becoming the law of the land. And this was done in an accelerated timetable, which again shows something, I think, of the urgency that's been attached to the issue that you mentioned just now, Christian. But you did have this sort of 30 years on counterposition of the Conservatives defending the structure that they had introduced in the 1993 legislation, which was being implemented 30 years ago to effectively break up British Rail into its sort of component parts, a separate track authority and a multitude of different passenger and freight operators. And at least as far as the passenger railway is concerned, the Labour government just elected throwing that process into reverse. But I think the ideological opposition of the Conservatives was a bit blunted by the fact that, of course, they themselves had said some 6 years ago that they thought the
May
system
2018 timetable chaos.
indeed,
Yeah.
that they thought the system wasn't working, and had embarked on their own reform program, as they would have said, to put track and train back together, or at least bring them more closely aligned, to introduce a single guiding mind, to introduce a body called Great British Railways. Although at the heart of that, they still intended, of course, to contract out the operation of passenger services to the private sector. And that's where this Labour model is so distinctively different.
I did see that Helen Whately, who many people might not know is the Shadow Transport Secretary, she said very firmly, this is an ideological move. It's only been done to satisfy Labour's kind of socialist, I'm not sure she used that word, but socialist instincts, and and debunked it. But as you say, oddly enough, even the name Great British Railways was a Borisonian invention. I mean, it was them who started this whole process after the May 2018 debacle. So, what's at the core of this legislation, then, Mark? What? It's quite a short bill, isn't it?
So what we see in this short bill are the changes to the law necessary to allow the Labour government to return the franchised operations to the public sector, either when contracts expire or when an operator has failed to perform sufficiently that their contract can be terminated early. And at present, that's actually unlawful as a result of the provisions of the Conservatives' 1993 Act and actually Labour's 2005 Act. There's still a requirement on the Secretary of State to have a sort of default position that passenger rail services should be delivered by private sector operators through franchise agreements. So that's the obligation which is extinguished through this bill. But there's also a provision, there are some escape clauses to allow them to extend contracts for the time being where they need to. Though Labour was very clear in the debates today that they envisaged those clauses being transitional and eventually sunsetting. And Labour has made it clear that they intend to use this legislation to ensure that all of those passenger franchised operations which are currently in the private sector have reverted to the public sector by the end of this parliamentary term. So roughly over the next 4 years or so.
Haven't they set a target that there's going to be 70% by next year?
There are
Which
some
is
targets
right.
floating about. I think they may be underestimating some of the complexities around these things because these things always turn out to be a bit more complex than you had envisaged. And there is no doubt an army of corporate lawyers who will be looking at all of these provisions to see what can be derived for those owning groups that continue to have the operations within their domain.
Do we know anything about how this is going to be structured? Because at the moment, there's 4 franchises within the operator of last resort, and they are very much run as if they were private, but so they run hands off from the Department for Transport, and there's no kind of overall control of them. So, is this going to now change? Is there going to be a direct involvement of this new great British Railways?
Well, what we've got is kind of real-time breaking news here, because to coincide with today's debates on the legislation, the Secretary of State for Transport laid a statement before Parliament and now announcing the establishment of shadow Great British Railways. So this is the organisation that eventually, without the term shadow, once the other railways bill has passed, will become the directing mind for the industry. But in the interim period, this shadow organisation will bring together the railway part of the Department for Transport, Network Rail, and the operator of last resort, which currently has those 4 former franchises within it: LNER, Northern, Transpennine, and Southeastern, and over time, those other franchises which revert to the public sector. And in fact, in the statement and in a letter that's gone out to stakeholders today, there's a description of how this new organisation will operate and what its purposes are. And it might be helpful to listeners if I were just to read what those 5 priorities are that have been set out. So one is improving services for passengers and freight customers. The second is unblocking barriers to delivery. The third is delivering financial sustainability. The fourth is designing end state GBR. Well, we've been there before, haven't we, under the previous government with the many years of the rail reform programme.
And debate over the structure, yes.
The structures and the enormous expenditure on that process that never came to a conclusion. And then finally, establishing leadership of the railway as shadow GBR. So this seems to be very much the mission now that's been embarked upon by the Secretary of State through the officials in the civil service and the leadership of the industry.
They love these missions, don't they? This is a very mission-oriented government, and they just kind of replicate that at the lower level. So there's the overarching kind of missions that the whole
five missions,
and so then there's 5 little missions that the Department for Transport, or rather Great British Railways, is.
And the Secretary of State had 5 transport policy objectives that
yes,
when she arrived in the department. Yeah,
they like the 5. Yes,
the magic definitely. Of 5. Yeah. There's definitely something in that.
And do we know anything about the structure of GBR? Because the big debate before the election was over the role of Network Rail and whether it would be at the top of the tree or whether it would be sort of controlled by a different body that would be above it and that would take an overall view of the industry. And I know that Network Rail was batting very strongly for that. And Peter Hendy, of course, who was chairman of Network Rail, is now the minister. But his hands will be tied by whatever Louise Haigh wants to do, and maybe even what Keir Starmer wants to do. And certainly before the election, there seemed to be a divergence of views there that certainly I don't think Lou Haigh had bought into the idea of Network Rail at the top of the tree. So are we any further in that debate?
I think there's a sort of criminological exercise here that goes on, I think, continuously to try to work out what this sort of end state is and how these various existing organisations will fit within it. Because, of course, Network Rail strenuously denied that it was going to be the dominant force within GBR and that it was somehow going to sort of transform into a new organisation.
Yes, it was going to be a different. I mean, I had some discussions with some senior people in
Indeed,
Network Rail, and
indeed.
they insisted in angry texts to me that this was not going to be the same Network Rail. It was not going to be engineer led. It was going to be this new type of Network Rail. And my view was that, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it probably is a duck. And so I didn't ever agree that Network Rail was going to use another animal analogy, change its spots when it was at the top of the tree. Now, my view is that it will not emerge from this as the kind of leading body. But I
Well,
don't know. That's
the
my opinion.
Secretary of State has been clear since before she was Secretary of State that she will be the passenger in chief.
Yes.
And it always therefore seemed to me that although there will be lots of cooperation, lots of sort of tripartite working, the dominant force within this, at least this transitional setup, will be the Department of Transport, led by the Secretary of State. And that's hardly surprising when you look at the amount of taxpayers' money that's still going into the rail industry day by day as a result of the legacy of the pandemic, the lockdown, and the travel restrictions and the changes to passenger travel patterns that there have been that have lasted, of course, for some 3 or 4 years now.
Yeah, something like 4 to 5 billion is the unexpected deficit, which of course you can't really save that sort of amount of money, and so at the end of the day, the Treasury has to cough up, but it doesn't like doing so.
Yeah, that's right. But it's definitely, I think there is at the very least, the shadowy, if not even more visible presence of the Treasury in all of these processes and negotiations. And indeed, that was an issue that came up during the consideration by Parliament today, because although the Conservatives were at pains to say they accepted that Labour has a mandate for public ownership of the railways through their landslide general election
And it was in the
victory.
manifesto.
And it
Yeah.
was in the manifesto, absolutely. So the Conservatives were, as is the job of the opposition, trying to paste onto the bill various amendments and obligations to try to move it slightly closer to their position. But one thing that they very much latched onto, and this is part of a bigger narrative about how the Conservatives are trying to describe this government, was that it's all kind of driven by the so-called union paymasters of the
Right.
Labour Party. So linking up the historic and financial links of the Labour Party with its affiliated trade unions, with the ideological question of public ownership being a good thing, but very specifically with the recent settlement of the train drivers' pay dispute, in particular with the ASLEF union over the summer, and suggesting that the government is doing the bidding of these paymasters. So how the Conservatives tried to sort of nail that issue onto the Labour government was that they put forward an amendment to the bill, which was to set up. It kind of said, well, now that the railways are going to be a public body, a bit like any other public body, you should have an independent pay review organisation, like happens in the NHS, for the police, for teachers, and so on. And although the government rejected that amendment, and when it was pushed to a vote, actually comprehensively voted it down using their big majority, they did reveal that this is an idea that they're looking at. And so they themselves recognize and must recognize that with the return of a pretty much single national rail system with a single national employer, and they've used that term explicitly, single national employer, or words to that effect, that they're going to have some process of pay review, terms and conditions review, bargaining systems that haven't existed across the industry while it's been in private hands.
Right. Oh, well, that's a very interesting, Mark. So, moving forward to round up this item, what next for it, and what's the timescale for this to become legislation? And is there
Well,
any news of the other bill,
it's got to go to the other. This bill's got to go to the other place,
other
as they
place?
say, down the corridor to the House of Lords now. And although the government has been able to use its big majority to get through the Commons on an accelerated programme, that's a tougher proposition when you go to the House of Lords. The House of Lords will accept the principle because it's a manifesto commitment. And so the House of Lords won't ultimately stand in the way of the return of train operations to the public sector. They will, no doubt, many noble lords will be putting forward clever amendments and clarifications and changes, and as they would say, improvements to the bill as it goes through the upper chamber. And so, although it hasn't yet, at least to the best of my knowledge, yet this evening been timetabled for debate in the House of Lords, presumably it's going to be heading there pretty quickly, but the government might find it's a slightly more complex proposition to get it through.
Right. So watch this space, as it were. And what about the other bill? Do we know anything about that?
All we know is that there appears to be, and people in the industry will roll their eyes at this. There appears to be an intention to have another round of consultation on this bill.
Right.
And colleagues in the industry, rail industry, will remember the endless rounds of consultation and voluminous submissions that they had to write during the Conservatives' rail reform process. Now, of course, Louise Haig's motto is move fast and fix things. So we might see this a little bit faster. And there is also a commitment to bring in the railways bill during the current parliamentary session, which means within the next year, and in practice to allow for proper scrutiny, probably within the next 6 months. So that's roughly the time scale we might expect to see for the railways bill that will formally establish Great British Railways, but will also provide for all sorts of other issues to be addressed, like, for example, fares and ticketing, which came up in the debates today. The Liberal Democrats tried to push through an amendment on fares and ticketing, like the status of the rail industry supply chain, which was brought up by Catherine Atkinson, the Derby North MP, today, who was mindful of the hiatus of rail industry orders that there were back in the mid-90s when the privatisation process was going in the other direction, and many companies faced greatly diminished order books during that period. And where we'd also expect to see in the railways bill the moves towards the reform of consumer representation and advocacy, which are promised in Labour's rail policy. So those are just some of the issues that will have to be addressed downstream.
And of course, last and not least, there's the small issue of what to do about HS2, which I'm sure we'll discuss another time in this podcast.
No doubt we will. Christian, you had a very interesting article in The Guardian earlier this week about the road building programme.
Yes, and very pleasingly, they put a lovely headline on it, which is, I've got a solution to the roads programme, scrap the 16 major schemes across the country. And that was basically my argument. Now, you might remember that Rishi Sunak had a big major roads programme that amounted to, at the time, they said 27 billion, but it's unclear about exactly how much of that is earmarked. And so it's probably nearer 22 billion. And again, you're never quite sure exactly how much of that is actually committed funding and how much is not. But it was, one of the hallmarks of conservative transport policy that, we need more roads, and they're vital for growth and absolutely essential for the future economy and so on. And this is a nice little pool of potential money that can be recycled. And so my argument was certainly that, if we're really heading towards net zero, if we're trying to get people out their cars, if we're trying to invest in more sustainable forms of transport, a huge roads program doesn't seem to be the way forward. And indeed, it has been shown over the years that, the more you build roads, the more they get filled up, the lanes get full, and then you immediately get pressure to build yet more roads because they attract people onto them. And if you instead spend the money on alternatives, particularly you make the railways more economic, more cheaper in relation to traveling by car, you'll attract more people onto it, and so on. It's all kind of very obvious stuff. And yet the last Labour government, which I pointed out in the piece, did initially start with some quite radical ideas. There was a kind of Transport 2010 document that was put forward at the end of the 90s by John Prescott when he was responsible for transport. And it boasted of 20 new tram schemes and integrated transport and shifting people out of their cars and so on. And it got largely killed off in the middle of that decade by what John Prescott called the teeny boppers in Number 10, who shifted it much more towards spending the money on roads. There was a transport minister, Gus MacDonald, Lord MacDonald, didn't really know much about transport, but he kind of definitely was a car person. And so, instead of 20 new tram schemes, we got basically one in that decade, and we've barely seen any more since, apart from kind of expansions of the Manchester network, and Edinburgh has got a scheme that again is now expanding. So the Labour needs to start off radical here, and cutting back on this program seems to be both a source of money and a way of showing radicalism. Now, Lou Haig has actually launched an internal review of the Department for Transport's capital program. Very kind of below the radar, kind of rather hush-hush. And decisions are expected relatively soon. But it would be a real statement if they kind of decided, right, we're going to cut much of this roads program. In particular, the biggest program out of that, the biggest scheme out of that is the Lower Thames Crossing, which will come in at a cool 9 billion. And that's kind of, before all the extra cost increases, because it involves kind of, I think, 9 miles of extra road and a tunnel under the Thames and connect and feeder roads around and blah, 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 And really, yes, the Dartford Tunnel is quite crowded at the moment, but and the Dartford Bridge. But if you really kind of intent on trying to reverse the trend of ever increasing kind of car use, then you have to be brave and make these decisions and spend the money elsewhere. So basically, the piece says, watch this space. It will be a big test of Labour in its kind of early days of its test of its kind of radical edge.
But let me pick you up on some of those points, because you talked about how the Labour government last time around initially massively reduced the Conservative road programme that it inherited, and then it sort of slowly reverted, didn't it, to become a road building government. What do you detect that might be different about this government that might cause this to be a policy that's adopted and a more permanently?
Well, we're a quarter of a century on, and what has happened in that quarter of a century? Well, net zero. The move towards net zero. That's a really big kind of shift, and the public is by and large quite supportive of move towards net zero. I think they have recognised that climate change is happening and is a danger, and transport is a big contributor. So that's something that might well kind of stop the government from immediately defaulting to a kind of pro-roads position. And ditto about pollution, the damaging effects of pollution, not just air pollution, but also noise pollution, living next to roads and all that, I think is much higher up the political agenda than it was a quarter of a century ago. So there is kind of a hope and expectation
But
that
of course, it's also the
this
desperate shortage of money, isn't it? I suppose as well in the current context, which is different from the position in the late 90s.
that's right. There was plenty of money to spend at the time, and then eventually quite a lot of it found itself on a renewed roads program, and really spending scarce resources on a similar program, does seem to run against the injunctions to cut back. I mean, if you can't afford pensioners getting their winter fuel allowance, can you afford 9 billion on a massive road scheme? So, this is a really interesting one to watch. The policy is up in the air. There's a decision to be made, and it's going to anger either one set of people or the other, either the environmentalist or the roads lobby.
But of course, one of the things about roads is that people tend to see them as a quick win for economic growth, don't they? That suddenly you get the growth from doing the work and digging the path of the road and laying the surface and all of the supply chain benefits that apparently come from that. And then you get all this traffic rushing around, which somehow is a measurement or a reflection of economic growth. Do you think that nowadays that's been debunked, that idea?
I think in the last quarter of a century it has. And what I'm getting from some of my contacts in the Department of Transport is that the whole process of assessing transport schemes has to change, right? So, the basic process called web tag, most of the benefits for many of the schemes come from time savings by people traveling. And that's as true of HS2 as it is of road schemes, right? But the road schemes benefit from this enormously because, you build a bypass and say, well, everybody using that bypass is saving 1 minute. 1 minute, is worth whatever, 20p or 30p or whatever. And you add all those 20 and 30p's together and you get very large sums, and those are the benefits. Now, this thing has to be changed, this whole kind of assessment. So, in a way, Lou Haig has to take the whole thing further back and look at how these schemes are assessed and judged, and how then, therefore, they can be listed, categorized, and a league table of which ones are the best and which ones are the worst kind of established. And the methodology mustn't favor roads in the way that it has in the past.
And of course, on cost grounds, they've already cancelled the A303, which would have gone under Stonehenge, and they've cancelled the A27. I think is the Hastings bypass. So,
Arundel.
Was it Arundel? Beg your pardon.
Yes, that's paying for 1 million potholes in the kind of mad economics of this.
That's right. That's right. So yes, they've already charted a course to some degree. But of course, when we come back for season 3, we'll be in the run-up to Rachel Reeves's budget and spending statement on the 30th of October. So I'm sure we'll be covering this in great detail. Here's Christian's final thought from the Departure Lounge.
Well, I had a book out earlier this year, and I've got another book coming out during season 3, early in November, and that's a revamp of my Fire and Steam History of Britain's Railways, which was published nearly 20 years ago. And the excuse for this is that next year will be the 200th anniversary of the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, sometimes perceived as Britain's first railway. In my view, it's actually the Liverpool and Manchester that was more important. But nevertheless, nothing like an excuse for an anniversary and a reprint of a book I'd already written. It's got a couple of extra chapters in it, and a introduction from none less than Peter Hendy, who at the time when he wrote it a couple of months ago was boss of Network Rail, and of course he's now the rail minister. And there's going to be a launch, and I hope that many of the listeners will be interested.
Calling All Stations, the transport podcast with Christian Walmart, is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do also follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle is @AllStationsPod.